What's up, everybody? We have 10 minutes here, and once again are joined by esteemed colleague, Mr. Ryan Muckenhern.
Ladies and gentlemen.
I like trying to come up with new ways to describe him every time, but I keep esteemed colleague is the latest one.
That's the latest one. I can tell you whatever you come with, come up with, it's going to be positive.
Right. Ryan's here to talk to us today because he does quite a bit of shooting down at the range, and oftentimes troubleshooting, customer scopes that get sent in, and it's a matter of one of those things where, hey, when I shake the scope, it doesn't sound like a maraca, so I can't immediately tell something is wrong with it, but I'm having some sort of an issue, and I'd like to at least rule out the variable of the scope. You go down and shoot a lot of these things.
What do you generally find, Ryan?
Very typically, it's attributed to mounting solution. And we've hammered that one to death, so to speak, but it really is the most persistent cause of failure.
Right.
But there are others.
And that kind of goes into what we wanted to talk about here real quick, which is we did a podcast with Ruben and Scott, and they came in and did essentially, why am I missing? Troubleshooting your misses. And we went into all kinds of things, and a lot of it was actually just around shooter. So that's an important variable in the whole shooting equation is you. Without you, the gun never actually fires, and you have to impart influence on it, and there's a lot of influence that can, whether it's actual physical, the trigger press, how you're holding it, all these things, or mental, just ways you're thinking of things that may be incorrect or whatever, or then, of course, there's environmental factors too. But we wanted to actually go into, it was suggested, this was a Trent suggestion, so you can online bully him a little bit if you want, Ryan.
It's futile.
But it was suggested.
I tried one time. He bullied back harder, and then I lost, and then I just gave up.
It's all right. He's good at that. That we do just a straight-up equipment troubleshooting checklist. You are at the range for some reason. You're not shooting the groups you feel you should be shooting. You're not getting on paper, or as you start to stretch out at distance, everything seems to be going haywire. What's the equipment straight-up checklist that you start going through to make sure all is well with my equipment? Now maybe I'll start thinking about me as a shooter or the environmentals and stuff like that.
Yep.
Where do you start and what do you go through?
Okay, so it really would depend on how the issue is manifesting. And so if we're just seeing erratic grouping on your paper, you're establishing your initial zero, and you're not getting the group that you would have expected out of that particular rifle or load or combination. A few things to check right away. Is the base secured to the rifle? Are the rings secured to the base? Are the rings securing the scope properly? In that order. I think a lot of people, especially when I'm troubleshooting with them, the first thing they'll start with, my rings are tight. And of course, we need to take into consideration ring torque, and we've talked about that in the past, but let's just assume that we're at proper torque value on the rings. We still have between 4 and 8 more points of contact just to get to the rifle.
Yeah.
Depending on the rifle, even more potentially, before we're secure to the gun itself. And so ring to base is a big one, and then base to rifle is a big one. A lot of folks take for granted the base is on there. It was probably Loctited either from the manufacturer or when I brought it into the gunsmith who mounted it. But check that out. That's a big one.
It's always worth, if you get a new rifle from the manufacturer and it has a base already installed, it's always worth either taking those little fasteners out and Loctiting them yourself and then re-torquing, or just going over with your torque wrench and just setting it at, I think, 20 inch-pounds, right? Yep. And just giving it a quick torque sequence, and that way you're sure.
Yes. And usually when you see the issue at the base level, what most folks, and I've seen this too in the past when I've discovered it on my own rifles or on test rifles that I use, is you'll see like an up-down shift or a left-right shift that is almost alternating. So you'll have two print, or one print, and they'll kind of make this alternating pattern. And what you're seeing there is the actual shift of that component, shot to shot.
And it gets a little bit worse over time too. It may start out as a small shift, and then it kind of gradually. And I think it was somebody was talking, it might have been Ruben or Scott, or somebody was mentioning this too. It can actually stay at a small shift for a relatively long time, but the looser it gets, then the quicker it gets looser.
Yes.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Another one that gets overlooked a lot with bolt rifles specifically is action screws. My esteemed colleague Graham had this beautiful PRS rifle built. He was shooting it for months. It was shooting fantastic. I happened to walk down to the range to do a range cert while he was getting zeroed pre-match, and they were having some very mysterious ghosts in this setup. It was a great scope, great rings, great load, great rifle, and it was probably a 2-minute group, and it was very interesting how it was depositing those rounds. And they went through everything. It was an integral base on the rifle's receiver, so we knew it wasn't the base. The rings were torqued properly. The muzzle device was secured, and we'll touch on that in a little bit. And I asked him about the action screws and whether or not he had seated it against the recoil lug pocket in the stock. And he said no. And so we broke the action screws loose and inverted the rifle, or pointed it up, I should say, and then while holding the barrel, a fairly firm tap onto the ground without allowing the stock to bounce. So I want you to think like when you're stabbing a shovel into the ground, you know, like on the buttstock, and then while holding that tension, torquing the front action screw first.
Okay.
And we went to 55 inch-pounds on that one, and on the back action screw, we went to 45. And then immediately took his rifle back to the prone position and fired a .0.
Whoa.
Yeah.
So when you kind of made that impact, whatever, you know.
Let's just throw this out to make sure the rifle's safe, all that
Yes.
stuff. Okay. Anyway, we got that out.
But you were kind of it sounds like you're almost like seeding something.
Exactly correct.
Okay.
So on most bolt-action rifles from modern manufacturer, you'll either have an integral or an installed recoil lug. And it is very much the same whether it's integral or installed. Its function anyway. Imagine a flat piece of metal between your receiver or possibly integral into your receiver on, say, like a Weatherby Mark V or a Kimber 84. Just a flat piece of metal that comes down and then recesses into a pocket and
in the stock.
In the stock, yeah, and then buttresses up against that face in that pocket. And so it's very important that it is properly and firmly seated against it. Some rifles like the Tikka T3 and T3X actually have the recoil lug feature as part of the stock, and then that interfaces with a slot at the bottom of the receiver. And again, we're accomplishing the same function. Some people argue the merit of one versus the other. I think as long as it's properly installed, that's all that matters. Like it's executing its purpose and function very well. But as an aside, the action screw torque can have a big impart on how your rifle shoots as well.
Okay, right.
If your front action screw was rock solid, but your rear action screw was loose, you could have a pivot point. Okay. And if you have that, every time you shoot, you're going to see something change. We're going to take for granted that the optic is mounted to the base correctly. And then in I guess some ways you could look at it as integral to the rifle's barrel and receiver, like it's one piece there.
Yeah, so that's why I'm wondering, why would the receiver's mating to the stock have anything to do with?
A couple things. You know how if you change pressure on a stock, you'll see your follow-through dictate a different POI.
Okay.
Right? It's kind of like that. Also, when we fire a rifle, there's a lot of like force going on. Like the barrel is physically whipping, and these things are designed to, we'll say, reverberate in a particular way. And if that reverberation sequence is interrupted, then the whole thing goes awry.
Okay. That actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, which brings me to my next one, muzzle devices. These are a really common killer. Especially, I see this with like AR-15s a lot. Shooter builds up this great AR, buys a great AR, whatever. It's got like an A2 bird cage or a muzzle brake of some variety on the end of it. And we're shooting for accuracy. Maybe it was great at one point in time, and then all of a sudden it's not. One question I'll always ask is, do you have a muzzle device on the rifle? If so, is it indexed properly and tight? If it's loose, imagine a tuning fork when we strike it. Like the barrel, okay, ding, it reverberates at this note. If we put influence on that tuning fork in varying places, we can stop that pitch from ringing, or we can modify that pitch. And the same thing is occurring there. We're changing that rate of reverberation and interrupting that cycle, which can throw the groups off. Jimmy Jordan, who's been on this podcast before, was troubleshooting his buddy's AR, and we tore the thing apart trying to figure out what was going on. It shot terrible. And, he checked the bird cage that was on the end of the barrel. It was just an A2 bird cage. It was actually an A1. It didn't even have the slots on the bottom, so it didn't have to be, quote, timed. But he checked it, and it was tight. And it was shooting terrible. I said, how tight is that? And he put the wrench on it, and he went to, check how loose it was. He went lefty-loosey on it, and it just, immediately threaded off.
Oh. He probably hadn't gotten to the point where he was, crushing the crush washer.
Correct. Exactly. It was just touching the crush washer. So he crunched that down, and it went back to shooting lights out.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Huh.
And so you might recall a rifle or a muzzle device from a company called Browning called the BOSS or BOSS, Ballistic Optimized Shooting System, I think is what it's called.
That is it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
My BAR.
I was just going to say,
has,
have that's where I heard of it before.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was, and and it does work. I could also call it the loss because I got some permanent hearing loss from a couple incidents, but it does work. I think they've gone away from it.
They have. It was somewhat complicated, but in theory, it makes a lot of sense. It's acting as either an extension to that tuning fork or an inhibitor or a muter to that tuning fork so that you can, by moving the weight point on the end of the barrel, change the frequency at which that barrel reverberates. And take a rifle that might not be shooting phenomenal to a rifle that is absolutely dialed down. And if you monkey with them, you can see some pretty amazing differences.
Yeah.
I think that's how it was advertised, if I recall. This was a lot of years ago. Essentially a tuning fork for your barrel.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
Very interesting.
So that's a big one to check too. So
Jim, you and I in Utah had a break that had kind of come free a little bit, and we were experiencing some erratic groups in
Utah. Was this
not Utah. Excuse me, Wyoming. Different.
Oh yeah. Okay. Now,
and then just couple turns, got her.
I do remember that. I do remember that was with your gun, right?
And the group's tightened up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something to check, right?
And then how about the timing of the device? Can that do any much, or does that more just change the recoil impulse? Or
It could. I'd need somebody who's a lot smarter than I am to kind of talk about physics. And when we think about that wave occurring down the barrel, I could see where if it was timed differently, it would change the way that wave cycle would occur.
you kind of think so?
Yeah. And so there is a possibility that it could. I'm unaware of any documentation that states if you change the tilt of your muzzle device, like on my competition rifles, I was tilting my muzzle devices a few degrees.
Well, yeah, I know some people do that actually, and it doesn't seem.
Yeah, and that was to really just mitigate a particular recoil sequence. Like I wanted the rifle to recoil a particular way, like it would have a torque or a torsion to it when you'd fire the gun. I would mod the position of that muzzle device to eliminate that, so that when I fired the rifle, specifically from a standing position, the rifle didn't torque when I was shooting it, so that it remained flat and I could go hard in the paint.
Whoa.
Yeah, sports.
Oh my, that's
Hit a slam dunk.
okay. Well, we had a moment of brilliance.
And then one other one that I want to talk about that happens, I hear this one a lot come September, October, when guys are going out and they're getting ready to zero their hunting rifles, guys and gals, I should say, because ladies hunt too. Slings attached to your rifle.
Right.
Okay.
And depending on your stock. So I'm going to pick on your Ruger American Predator pre-stock upgrade.
Pre-new stock. Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a stock right back there behind you.
Fairly flexible.
Yes.
When you grab that thing and
especially out near the bipod sling swivel end.
yes, way far end of that lever there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen it before. I've done it before where I have the sling on the rifle and I put the rifle in my shooting bags or on my shooting rest and inadvertently preload the sling, either straight back or to the side or to the other side, and it affects my POI.
Interesting.
Because I'm starting to flex that stock. And up front, like you could have inadvertent barrel contact.
Absolutely. That happens all the time especially when you put that particular stock on a bipod.
Yep.
Lots of barrel contact.
That's
interesting.
Yeah, that's going to throw your POI. in a best case scenario, you maintain that contact, and you'll have a migrated POI. If you're like really good at it, you could keep it consistent. I'm not really good at it. So you end up with these varying degrees of contact on the barrel. Ergo, we have different POIs.
Yes.
The sling can do the same thing. It can pull the front of that forend over to touch the barrel or down, and potentially, depending on the rigidity of the stock, potentially move it as far enough to start messing with that interface between recoil lug and recoil lug pocket.
Yeah, okay.
So when I zero a rifle with a sling, I take the sling off.
Sure.
Yep. And some rifles, like I shoot a Kimber Mountain Ascent, the forend has full contact on the barrel, which everybody talks about. Oh, you want to free float your barrel. Sometimes you want to free float your barrel. Sometimes you want full contact. Sometimes you want forend pressure. Depends on the gun.
Okay, well, here's another 10-minute talk on the docket.
Right? So with that gun having full contact on the barrel, if I were to take a hasty sling position, which is kind of an older, now obscure means of shooting accurately at distance, where you loop your arm through the sling.
I was just going to ask about that.
Okay, yes.
If I do a hasty sling solution when firing, I will change my POI tremendously.
So that's why I always miss when I'm shooting offhand. That is the reason. There is no other reason. That is the reason.
There you go.
There isn't another.
600
Jim,
yards,
it's the sling.
Jim slung up and shot. If the rifle is set up appropriately and that is taken into consideration, typically you'll see these barrels free floated, or the sling attachment point reinforced, or the stock is of heavy enough material or thickness or something stout and rigid, and you hasty sling, it can be a huge improvement.
Okay.
On that particular rifle, to pick on it, there is enough give at the stock at that point in a hasty sling solution where I'll actually start interfering with my barrel.
Yes.
Via the barrel channel.
And by hasty sling solution, you're essentially talking about kind of like wrapping your arm
Yep.
into the sling.
You
for
figure eight yourself
added
in there.
Exactly.
Stability.
To add rigidity and stability.
So we're at the classic 10-minute talk, 17 minutes, but I am going to throw out one more thing. Going back to the rings, which you mentioned, is sometimes people inadvertently, or not even necessarily inadvertently, you just get it because you have to, whatever, you get a set of rings that either goes into a dovetail in the receiver, or the rings themselves have some sort of a windage adjustment. And so we've seen many times, on many occasions, that the two rings themselves are not in proper alignment to one another, or the two holes that they make for your scope to go in are not concentric to one another, because windage, mechanical windage, has been dialed into one of the rings. And you didn't know it was. It came out of the box that way, whatever. You don't even know what that knob does necessarily. I know I wouldn't have, you know, many years ago. Or you're trying to drift them into a dovetail, and it's difficult to get them properly aligned. So that's something also worth checking. Would you check that with like a lapping bar, perhaps, to make sure that they are properly concentric to one another?
Yeah,
okay.
That's a good way to do it. And the rings Jim is talking about specifically could be like the Burris Signature Series windage adjustable, the old Redfield, the Leopold standards, and that front ring pivots in place. And then the rear ring actually just kind of sets there and then is held in tension by two large drums or screws. And yeah, a lapping bar is my favorite way. I put the lapping bar in, and then I put like a 5/16 wrench or the alignment tool for those rings, because they actually make one.
Yeah.
And I just kind of move that front ring back and forth until that lapping bar seats. And then I want to make sure that I can move it fore and aft without any impingement, and then I'll rotate it on its axis as well to make sure that it doesn't.
So you're not just using it to check it; you're using it to actually
align it.
Align it and mount the rifle scope
absolutely.
beforehand. Okay.
It's literally it's performing an alignment on your rings. It's like performing an alignment on your car.
Yeah.
Would you want to drive down the road with one wheel pointing in that way and the other wheel pointing straight? You're just going to skid, you know?
If you want to go
have
through
everything
a
going
bad
straight.
pair of tires, that's a good way to do it, I guess.
I reckon so. Yeah. Want to go through a cheap old scope, you know? Why not?
Why not?
So there you have it. Okay, well, this was a 20-minute talk. Oh, well. We gave you guys hopefully some troubleshooting stuff that you can go through when you're at the range if you ever find yourself in the situation, which hopefully, if you just pay a little bit extra attention when you're setting everything up, you won't. But as Ryan pointed out, it even happens to us sometimes. And, you know, we're perceived to be the pros. So it's okay if it happens. You just go about your business, get it fixed, and get back to shooting. So, thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks,
Bye.
Ryan. Bye. What do you think? I forgot to go over my favorite technique for troubleshooting is I shoot the gun and then I call Ryan and bring it and say, hey, fixie.
No worky, no good.